Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Tuesday, December the 20th. Not quite certain what happened yesterday, but I went through all the protocols to make sure that everything's up and working, and it seems that we're doing fine this morning. So let's just chalk it up to Christmas. How's that? Can you believe it? Today's December the 20th. This weekend, we're going to be celebrating a number of services on our various campuses for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and really looking forward to that. This is our first Christmas where all of our boys are married now, and so we have to kind of share them with in-laws. So this is a new experience for Cindy and I, but we're both, many of you know my wife is a nurse, and so she's working Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and so am I. Christmas falls on a Sunday, so we'll be pretty busy, and we'll catch up with our boys, probably the day after Christmas. But all good. That's one of the things we're grateful for this year. They found wonderful women, and we're grateful that God has provided for them in that way. So this is all. It's all good. We have been in a series that we have entitled God's People Living Generously. So during this Advent season, what we've tried to do is bring to the forefront the generosity that has been displayed in the coming of Jesus. That throughout this biblical narrative of the birth of Jesus, there is this note that God is always at the forefront of meeting our needs, right? So, for instance, we looked at this incarnation as a model of generosity because God gave his most treasured possession, his own son, right? Is that the one of the most notable verses in the New Testament, right? God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So this begins with God looking at a world in need and then acting on its behalf, giving his most treasured possession, his son. And then it goes on to say that Jesus, he comes and he says, he gives his life. He lays down his life for you and for me. And if that were not enough, then we go on and we see that Mary has given her future. Joseph has given his reputation. We see the shepherds giving their time, the Magi their resources. All of which you see in this whole unfolding of this biblical story. There's always this sense that people are giving and receiving, right? So there is this note of generosity that appears through it all. So we have then taken a look at Luke chapter 16. And what I'd like to do now is continue our study a little more, but we're going to take it back to a passage that we'll find here in Luke chapter 16. And I thought it would be good to read the whole text again today, and then we can continue on in our study. It says, Jesus is with his disciples, right? We had just finished looking at the three parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. And in that, it was in the context of the Pharisees taking issue with Jesus and the way in which he was engaging tax collectors and sinners. They didn't like the company that Jesus was keeping. And so Jesus sought to underscore this growing animosity by pointing out three stories where something is lost and then is found. And in the losing and in the finding, there is such a note of joy and jubilation. Why? Because when that shepherd found that lost sheep, he was so excited, he called all of his friends to let him know. When the woman lost her coin inside the house, she called all her friends to let him know. When the prodigal son comes home, the father, what does he do? He throws a party, right? Why? Because his son was lost, but now is found. It was always a cause for celebration. And Jesus, even in telling those stories, says, and such is the joy in heaven, right? When one sinner repents. So we recognize that what Jesus is really underscoring in Luke chapter 15 is the fact that God finds value with us. He loves us the same way we express that love for for our animals or our stuff, right? For people, God's saying He loves us. We are of value to Him. And the reason why the Pharisees were having such a hard time with Jesus is because they really didn't value those tax collectors and sinners. They saw no value in them whatsoever. And it had more to say then about their heart than about God's. Because God's heart was always the one who was out there looking to bring about a reconciliation, seeking to build these bridges, because He knows that if you change a person's heart, you change the whole direction of their life. You have them experience something of the fruit of God's Spirit in their life, which is what? Love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. You let a person begin to experience the fruit of that Spirit in their life, and it changes them. They certainly will become more loving, more joyful, right? More patient, more kind. A faithfulness, all of which shows that with the presence of the Spirit of God that now begins to lead and direct in a person's life, we're changed. And we're changed not only in this life, but He says He will change us so that we will enjoy the kingdom of heaven. So right after that, Jesus then continues, and He says to His disciples, He gives them this story. He says, now there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions, right? So here, this rich man has a manager who's working for him and is wasting the rich man's possessions. He's not a good manager. In fact, notice what it says. It says, so he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. So he's getting relieved of his duties. There is this crisis now that he is facing. And so the manager then sits down and takes a personal inventory. He's got to come up with a plan. He's saying, I don't know what really I should do now. He says, my master is taking away my job. And then he says, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. And then he thinks, I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. You see that? That's found here, right, in Luke chapter 16, verse 4. What he does now is begin to put a plan in motion so that, notice what it says, so that when I lose my job here, I will be welcomed into their houses. In other words, his master is kicking him out of the house that he had because he was a manager of the man's estate. He had a residence there, but now where's he going to go? He has showed himself to be dishonest and as a result, wasting the rich man's possessions. And so he's just finding a soft place to land. He just wants to come up with a plan to make his life better. But you notice there's no repenting. There's no like, oh, you know what? I should have done a better job. I'm really sorry. Yeah, can I have another chance? There's nothing like that. This is always about the manager. It's always about him finding a soft place to land, right? And it has nothing to do with whether or not he has been fulfilling the obligations to the rich man. Yeah, none of that is in this text. It's always about the dishonest manager. But notice also this manager, this is how good a job he's been doing. He calls in his master's debtors and he asks them, how much do you owe my master? Don't you think if he's the manager of the rich man's, stuff, that he would have a pretty good inventory? So see, again, it's just underscored how bad he is at his job. He's got to ask the debtors to come, and he's asking them, how much does my master owe you? And there's no telling whether or not what they're saying is the truth. They could be figuring out like, hey, if this guy doesn't know how much I owe, maybe I'll just lowball the number. So when the one debtor turns around and says, I owe him 800 gallons, right? Maybe he's kind of hoping he doesn't figure out that he actually owes him 1,000 gallons. I mean, we don't know for sure, but the whole tenor of this text is everybody's looking out for themselves. And so when the dishonest manager asks him, notice what he says. He says, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. And then he says to the second, how much do you owe? And again, he says, 1,000 bushels of wheat. And he says, okay, take your bill and make it 800. Now, at this point in the story, don't you realize that the dishonest manager is actually causing these other debtors to become complicit in his own response? What do you think the response of the rich man would be to those debtors who are now finding themselves receiving a 50% discount, a 20% discount? Yeah, you see, this is what happens when sometimes we're looking out for ourselves. We engage people in our own plans of deception, and there is this temptation that's always appealing to our baser interests here. And so all they're doing is now trying to come alongside these debtors and making his life better. So this is where the kicker in the story really comes in, because it says the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. So instead of the rich man coming, the rich man, it's kind of like he shakes his head and he says, he commends the dishonest manager because of the way he acted shrewdly. He's not commending his strategy. What he is commending is like the dishonest manager was just trying to make life better for himself. He says he's pretty shrewd. Now, Jesus then adds here, he says that the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And so he draws this comparison then, right? In this parable between the people of this world and the people of the light. We have been told consistently that the people of the light are those who are following the truth as we find it in Jesus. That his teaching now becomes the guardrails by which we are beginning to establish our life. He who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man that builds his house on a rock, so that when the storms of life comes, we'll be able to weather those storms. Yeah, see, all of the teaching of Jesus is to enter in by this narrow way because it leads to life. But the people of this world, we get sucked into thinking that it's only about this world. So we may as well just eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we're dead. No. There is a world to come. There is an accounting that will take place when we stand before God. See, that is one of the tenets of the faith that you and I embrace, that we one day will stand before God and give an account for this life. We want to make sure that we're covered with Jesus. We want to make sure that we are experiencing something of his grace, and it doesn't become something about our own performance. Because no man is going to get in because he's good enough. That's why Jesus came. That's why God sent his son. Well, notice what Jesus then says, and this has been the topic of our discussions then throughout this Advent season. Jesus begins to break this down a little bit more for us, and he says, we ought to be using worldly wealth to gain friends for ourselves, right? So that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. See, so the use of worldly wealth is so that at the end of the day, we have so invested them that we will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. See, the dishonest manager did it. He used his worldly wealth so that he could be welcomed into the debtors' homes. No. Here it says that the people of the light ought to be using worldly wealth, right? So that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This is all about making sure that we're using the wealth of this life, the resources that we have in this life, always with a view of eternity, which means that I'm investing worldly wealth now in a way that honors God's agenda. It's demonstrating that I care about what God cares about. You know, at the end of Matthew 23, there was this text, right, where Jesus said he separates the sheep and the goats, and he says, "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was sick and in prison, you visited me." And the people said, "Lord, when did we do that?" He said, "When you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it unto me." See what he's saying there? He's saying to feed someone, to clothe someone, to give them something to drink, all of which is a matter of the use of our resources. God's saying, you've invested them in what I would invest in. And that's in these people, and doing it in a way that demonstrates something of the heart of God. It's showing that I care about what God cares about. And so consequently, these eternal dwellings are wide open to me because I'm always about my Father's business. So is that the way we look at our stuff then? Do we realize that one day there is going to be this accounting? Do you recognize that you don't want to be accused of using, as it says in the beginning of our parable here, of wasting God's possessions? There's going to be an accounting. And we ought to be then investing the things that we have in this life in people, because that's the only thing that's going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, right? It says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust cannot destroy and thieves break in and steal. Because see, this is not about stuff. This is about the investment that we have given to God's agenda. We care about what God cares about. And so consequently, that's an attitude that we ought to carry with us in the way in which we use the resources that God has put to us, whether it's our talents, whether it's our time, whether it's our treasure, all of which is demonstrating that we are caring about what God cares about. But notice then Jesus goes on and talks a little bit more then about what it means to be a trusted manager. He says, look, whoever can be trusted with little can be trusted with much. Whoever's dishonest with little will be dishonest with much. So this is about a character issue, isn't it? It's about the way in which we are demonstrating our stewardship, our management of the resources that God has given us, whether it's a little or it's much. But I hope that as you've been following along in the story, that you're also recognizing here in verse 11, when Jesus says, so, on that principle, right? Faithful with a little, you'll be given more, right? You can be trusted with more. Dishonest with a little, you're going to be dishonest with a lot. Then Jesus says, so, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? So you see, now the analogy in the little and the much has been taken up a notch, because now what we're talking about here is the comparison between worldly wealth and true riches. When are those true riches going to come? When we're welcomed into these eternal dwellings. So if you're looking forward to heaven, if you're looking forward to this time that you will be once again reunited with God, that this life will now all of a sudden be consumed with not temporal things, but with eternal things. Jesus is saying, yeah, the litmus test is here is you got to be trustworthy with your worldly wealth if you're going to be trusted with true riches, heavenly wealth. Again, underscoring the fact that we got to demonstrate in word and in deed that we are good managers of what God has given us in this life if we can expect to have this inheritance in this life to come. You catch that? And not only that, but he says, if you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, who is going to give you property of your own? Usually it works the other way around, right? You show yourself, trustworthy with your own, then somebody's going to give you some of theirs. But here it goes back to this parable, right? The rich man was counting on the manager being faithful with his resources. It says here, if we're not trustworthy with someone else's property, which is God's, we are managers then of what God is providing. All those resources of the days in which you are alive, the gifts that you have. So what are we doing with those gifts? How are we investing them in kingdom purposes? How are we pursuing a path that is demonstrating that I am caring about what God cares about? Which means that I am investing my life in the people with whom I come in contact. I am then to be a good steward of this grace that God gives me, that I am willing to share that with others. And it's not just, a good word, because there are other places in the Bible, right, where you read, some would look at those in need and say, hey, I'll pray for you, be filled and be warm. No. How about buying them a blanket? How about getting them a coat? How about giving them a plate of food? And we're not being called to come alongside people in their own laziness and slothfulness. There's plenty of passages that we looked at that discourage that. In the book of Thessalonians, it says, if any man doesn't work, neither let him eat. So there is a sense that some people, they are bringing upon themselves their misfortune. But there are plenty of examples of people through no real, fault of their own, find themselves in difficult situations where an act of kindness, a generous act would make a very huge difference in that person's life. And Jesus says, every time you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. And that's why you're being ushered into this eternal dwelling. Because your life was all about God's life. Well, let's take it to the end now. In verses 13 and 14, 15, it says, no servant can serve two masters. Either he's going to hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So there is this, so just take that one here. You can find that there is a divided, heart here. You live with two value systems. There's one value system of the world that says basically he who has the most toys wins, right? And then you have this value of God that's saying, no, you need to be investing in the least of these. You got to be showing my love, my kindness to the world, to all kinds of people. You need to be generous with your stuff. You have to live generously if you're part of God's people. So how are you supposed to do both? See, what happens, it has everything to do with the devotion of one's heart. I have a misplaced devotion. It's all about serving my own interests rather than serving the interests of God. You cannot do both. You can't walk to the left and to the right at the same time. In fact, did you realize that the word repentance is a word that speaks of turning and walking in the other direction? That's what it means to repent. It literally means that I start walking in the other direction. Because, see, I can't walk in two directions at the same time. And that's why Jesus would say in other places, maybe you remember these verses where he says, I wish that you were either hot or cold, but you're lukewarm. So I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. See, this is Jesus saying, look, you got to choose this day whom you're going to serve. A divided heart is not going to cut it. You got to draw the line and say, no, this is the day that I choose to walk after Jesus, because I understand that with him I will find life in all of its fullness. I will learn what it means to put off the deeds of this body and begin to live and act more righteously. I will experience more of his peace. I will have hope. And the love of Christ will be poured out into my heart through the Spirit that he has given to me. But you know what else it says here? Look at verse 14. It says the Pharisees who loved money. Now the Pharisees were the religious leaders. They were the ones that were supposed to be giving people spiritual direction. But they're the very ones that are finding it difficult to live with an undivided heart. And so what does it say here? It says they heard all of this, and what do? They sneer at Jesus. They're like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. Why? Because they didn't just have a divided heart. They have a displaced love. The reason why I say their love is displaced is because their love is on money. It's because what does money represent? It represents power, privilege, possessions, pleasure. There's that old country western song that says, money, money isn't everything, right? But he says, but money can buy a boat. money can buy a house. Money can buy something to drink and eat, right? And there's a truth to that. But when you serve that master, it is never going to go well. You find yourself compromising yourself on 1,001 ways. Look at this dishonest manager. Not only is he cheating the rich man, but now he's drawing in all these other debtors into his own scheme. Why? Because he wants his life to be better. Just recently with this whole, cryptocurrency scheme, don't you see that this young kid, 30 years old, right? He's out there and he was trying to buy influence. He was trying to use all this money so that he would be this huge player. And he's forfeiting his life now. If he's convicted, he's going to spend a lot of time away in jail and in prison. Why? Because his ambitions just ran amok. No, here's a text now that's saying you can't have a divided heart and you cannot live with a displaced love. Jesus then says, you're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men. But God knows your heart. And what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. You got to make sure that your values are not detestable any more than you have to have a displaced love or a divided heart. The only way to do that is make sure that God's agenda is yours, that you care about what God cares about, and you're demonstrating that in your words and in your actions, that you are using whatever the resources our Father in heaven has given to you, whatever those talents are, whatever that sphere of influence that you have, you are demonstrating by your life that you care about what God cares about. My friends, that's what it means to be God's people living generously. So I hope today this kind of settles in, and we'll talk about those three things later in this week as we get ready to celebrate this greatest gift that was given, an unspeakable gift. We'll talk about What does it mean to live with a divided loyalty, divided heart? What it means to have a misplaced love. And detestable values. God's word has something to say about all these things. So my friends, be challenged by these scriptures. Lean into it. Seize the day in his name. And remember that we serve a God who is good all the time. God bless you. And Lord willing, we'll spend more time again tomorrow. God bless.